I think Afrikaners will eventually, it might not be even de jure, but they would de facto be ruling themselves again. And the state will either become so weak that it won't be able to, push them around or force them to obey its laws, or they will, with a little bit of help from friends, what's that Beatles song, with a little bit of help from my friends, they will get some form of territorial, self-determination in South Africa.
My guest is Dan Roodt, author, activist, and political commentator, podcaster, YouTuber. He's the founder of PRAAG, that's the Pro-Afrikaans Action Group, PRAAG, and it's an organization that he established in the year 2000 to advocate for Afrikaner rights, cultural preservation, and self-determination. I will put Dan's, he's also, as I said, he also has his own YouTube program, so I'm going to put the link, Dan, to your YouTube program in the commentary box if people want to follow your work. Welcome to the program. It's the second time that you and I are meeting.
Yes, well, thank you very much, Johan. I feel honored to have this discussion with you.
It's a funny thing, Dan. We have to kind of get used to, we've just spoken Afrikaans, you Afrikaans, I'm Afrikaans, we're doing this in English, so we have to kind of get into the rhythm of the English first before I think the discussion will flow, but I'm sure it's going to be okay. And I must just stress to people who are questioning that I'm doing that because I've got quite a lot of international viewers, and there are quite a substantial number of Black South Africans that are also following this podcast. To kick off with, Dan, I just mentioned it to you. I'm at the moment in this rather silly discussion or dispute with some folks on social media, etc., who are criticizing me for platforming people such as yourself. I've been accused of platforming so-called extreme right-wing voices in South Africa by the South African left wing. My question to you is, are there still, in my understanding of these things, I'm puzzling, I'm sitting in Europe and I'm trying to figure out what does the South African and especially the Afrikaner scene look like. Who are the left-wingers in South Africa and what do they propagate?
Well, South Africa has had a very, a small but vociferous leftist movement all along the 20th century. In fact, it started even in the late 19th century. And these people, of course, they pulled off something that very, apart from, say, Lenin and his friends in USSR, I mean, they pulled off a huge revolution in South Africa against all odds. In 1960, I mean, I can go into these things in detail, which we don't have to do now. But in 1968, the ANC wanted to disband because they were getting nowhere and all their people were on Robben Island and so on. And then Joe Slovo told them they were having some sort of a conference in Tanzania at this place called, I think it's a game park called Mohoro or something like that. I'm probably not mispronouncing it, but it is something like that. And then Joe Slovo, or the leader of the Communist Party, stood up and said, no, don't get so pessimistic. We're still getting £30,000 from the Soviet embassy in London, so we can go on indefinitely on the £30,000. And, if it hadn't been for his comment there, I think the whole thing would have just become extinct right there and then. But of course, after that, the ANC got the Swedish money, and then it started to gain momentum. And I think that also corresponds to my view of South Africa, which was also enunciated by the famous Jan Smuts, previous South African Prime Minister, who also got a standing ovation from both houses of Parliament in the United Kingdom at the end of the Second World War. And he was a great hero and a friend of the British royal family.
Yeah.
And he said that the future of South Africa will always be determined outside its own borders. And I think, up until now, we've seen that play out. And then the ANC was the same thing. And the left got into power in South Africa due to help from outside, due to interference in our internal affairs in South Africa, and due to financial, military, and communication support. And that's how the whole revolution happened.
Dan, help me to unpack and to understand the Afrikaans people, folk today, 30 years post-apartheid. Give me an idea of your view. Simple questions like, who represents the majority view amongst Afrikaners? This is a question that I ask a number of people that I've interviewed. Would that be AfriForum and Solidarity, etc., etc.? In other words, more right-wing leaning?
Yes, I would say definitely they represent the majority view. Definitely. There was some years ago, maybe 20 years ago even, I got invited to some presentation at the Nospash building here in Auckland Park, just opposite the SABC. Media Park, as it's called. And the Articafia organization, they did some sort of a survey among Afrikaners and also tried to establish the various different identities of Afrikaners living in certain areas. And the ones, only 5% of Afrikaners live in Johannesburg, but a lot of them are involved in media and the arts and so on. So they tend to be more left-wing than the rest. But the ones living in Centurion, say, or, the rural Western Cape or the Free State, or, the rural, Northwest and, more the farming areas and so on, what we call the platteland. Those ones, they're all, within this sort of AfriForum mold, I would say. And they are definitely not leftists. So the only ones that are remotely to the left, I think, are the ones in Johannesburg and to a lesser extent maybe in Cape Town, and the ones at the universities, because, I don't know whether you ever read that French novel Soumission by Michel Houellebecq, the most famous current French author, but it's about the fictitious Islamization of France, where France gets an Islamic leader, president, and in the book, in one day, all the university professors convert to Islam, and I think the same thing happened here in 1994. Within a few years, maybe not in one day, most of the university professors converted to some form of sort of Marxism or left liberalism or whatever. And you suddenly, the same people who were using more kind of neutral terminology before, they suddenly, you started hearing things about post-colonialism and capitalism and equality and egalitarianism and racism and all these sorts of concepts. So I think, and they've did that to keep their jobs, or in an attempt to keep their jobs, because a lot of them did get fired. And the other irony is that I've met some of these academics and people who, when you read the stuff that they write, it's sort of, it's sort of mainstream leftism. They've got all the references and the terminology and whatever. But when you speak to them privately, one-on-one, in a sort of a confidential situation, they tell you that they absolutely cannot stand it and that they are ready to actually resign their posts and immigrate, because they're completely fed up with this whole thing. So there's a sort of a cognitive dissonance. There's a lot of cognitive dissonance in South Africa, but especially among Afrikaners. A lot of them are only pretending certain things in order to survive. And everybody is in survival mode in a way. I mean, a lot of people have been impoverished. I mean, if you drive, in the East or the West Rand or even Bloemfontein and places like that, parts of Pretoria, you can see that people are poor, and they're struggling to survive because they don't have jobs anymore. And, they've got to try and survive in small businesses. It's a tough life for many people out there. But then people on the left say, no, but Afrikaners still have it very good. No, they don't have it so good. And we went from the 20th biggest economy in the world to about number 40. So the size of the cake has got smaller, relatively speaking. And, there are so many newcomers who are now slicing this cake, and the government itself is of course consuming a huge amount. I mean, if you see around here where I live, if you see the kind of cars that all these people drive, and there's a small section of government connected people in South Africa who live the Hollywood lifestyle. They more so than in many other really rich parts of the world. I mean, I spent some time in Fairfax County in the United States, close to Washington, DC, and it's supposed to be the richest county in the USA. And I didn't see as many expensive cars there as I do here in Johannesburg.
Yeah. Let me ask you a very broad question.
Yes.
As we are, as South Africa finds its way into the future, as we're navigating our way into the future, and I want to focus on the Afrikaners. I'm not talking about white people and black people. I'm talking specific about this group.
Okay.
White people, white Afrikaners. Do they, in that navigating the future of South Africa, do they still play a significant role? Are they still a factor?
I think they do play a significant role, in various respects.
I talk about in shaping the future, Dan.
Shaping the future, no, and that's the irony of it all. They're not playing a role at all. It's as if they have. I mean, in a way, Mr. de Klerk abdicated in 1994, and he took the whole of the Afrikaner people with him, and they have sort of abdicated from their traditional role in the country, and they play. If you look at, I mean, I thought the other day, it occurred to me, there was that movie with the title "My Great Big Fat Greek Wedding" or something. And it occurred to me that the DA, the official opposition, was this great big fat English party. And there are Afrikaners involved in that party, but they do not have leadership roles. And, there's now some talk about, John Steenhuisen, he's not going to be the leader anymore, and he's going to be replaced by the mayor of Cape Town, Jordan Hill-Lewis. I will never be able to spell his first name because it's a sort of a Jordan, but spelt in a peculiar way. But yes, so, and if you look at I think Herman Gillimeer, the historian, also said it once, that the Afrikaners lost their ideology in a way. So they don't have an ideology anymore. And they're sort of caught between liberalism and Marxism, which they don't really identify with. So they're looking for an idea, I think. And that's, in this whole kind of populist nationalism that's taking root in the world. I think a lot of them do identify with that, but it isn't being articulated really in South Africa. The Afrikaners, at a certain point, they didn't fail because they failed militarily or politically or anything like that, but they failed intellectually, I think. They were not really au fait with what the enemy thinking was, and eventually they couldn't really argue against that because they didn't understand it. They didn't understand all of this stuff at all. I mean, I remember when I was still at Wits, I met up here and there with people studying at the old Rand Afrikaans University and places like that. And then I started talking about sort of political theory and stuff to them. And then didn't know anything about, I mean, apparently in their courses, they did have a sort of a small section of on Marxism and whatever, but it was sort of studied in a certain kind of very almost like a high school fashion, that they had to just do the basics about the Soviet Union and the Russian Revolution and so on. But they didn't realize that this whole ideology was active in South Africa, and it was about to spring a great big thing on them, and that they were going to have to not only fight it, physically, but they were going to have to confront it intellectually and come up with counter arguments, which they never did. I think, I spoke to General Constant Viljoen once, and he told me that he expected, in the early 90s, he expected the fight in South Africa, or the confrontation, to be 20% military and 80% politically. But in the end, he realized it was going to be 100% political and 0% military. And that's exactly how it played out. So, and I think in effect, some of the Afrikaner leaders, they just kind of walked over to the other side. People like Rolf Meyer, I think he didn't have any resistance whatsoever. And I even heard stories from Chris Lowe, who was a journalist at the time, that he eventually didn't argue with the ANC about their positions. He argued with the cabinet for them to accept the ANC position. That was the whole way it played out. Yeah. So we left in limbo, really, and Afrikaners, I think, are still to some extent under the shock of this whole revolution that's happened in the country.
I want to just rephrase that question now, Dan. In the evolution of South Africa, at least modern South African, if I then say modern South Africa, I would talk 1650 to 54, arrival of Van Riebeeck. In this whole evolution, I'm going to rephrase exactly the same question. Yes. Is there, in realistic, do the Afrikaners still matter in terms of the prognosis for the long-term future of South Africa?
Well, I think they do, in the sense that they are still here, and they they have been dislodged from most of the institutions. There's been a whole institutional revolution in South Africa, but they are still on the land, for one, and that is a point of frustration, or an element of frustration for the government, because they just don't seem to get them off the land, because they've had so many programs of so-called land reform and land redistribution and so on, but somehow, if you drive along, these vast, in the countryside, and you see these vast tracts of land, And a lot of that still belongs to the Afrikaners, and they are still doing the stuff that they've been doing there for centuries. And the country is also dependent on them because they need them to grow food. And in fact, we probably feed most of Southern Africa when it comes to agricultural production. So the fact that we are still there, that is a major factor, because in all of the other African countries where there was sort of, what would you call it? Okay, so-called decolonization and all the other terms that people have invented for that, independence. If you look at, of course, the extreme example of Algeria and France, more than 1 million French people had to leave within a month, after the massacres at Oran and other places. And in the Congo as well, you had these very violent sort of so-called national revolutions or independence movements, sudden independence. And that hasn't happened in South Africa. So, these people are still here. They still doing, and the other thing is that they are surviving, and they are finding a kind of a modus operandi to cope also on a practical level with the system. I explained to you previously how we live here in a kind of a security state, and there are now, all over the cities, there are these so-called security villages and so on that are like, they are also the modern day version of the laager, and people live behind walls and with security, and they make their lives there. And also the internet has put us into contact with the rest of the Western world. I know lots of people who actually wouldn't find jobs in South Africa, but they work online for companies or even universities offshore in other countries. So, people are surviving, and that in itself is significant. There's still a lot of hardcore power under Afrikaners, and they are still organized, and they are armed as well. The government has had successive laws trying to make it more difficult, and they have made it more difficult to own firearms in this country. But in practice, many people still do own firearms. Yeah. I think there are about 4 million private firearm owners in South Africa. So, yes. So the Afrikaners are there. Also, the other thing that struck me the other day was that, I looked at some immigration statistics, and it's very difficult to tell who's immigrating and who isn't. Apparently there's about 250,000 South Africans living in the UK, almost that many in Australia, and then you've got US. Even in the Netherlands, there are about 40,000 of them. But I suspect, and there's a Wikipedia page about that as well, but I suspect, and the Wikipedia page affirms that, is that English speakers are mostly immigrating. Some Afrikaners are going too, but not to the same extent. So the million odd English speakers, their ranks are being thinned out through the immigration process, whereas more Afrikaners are staying.
Let me pick it up there, Dan. You created two images in my head now, two narratives, in fact. One is that of the Afrikaner people have become disenfranchised. And on the other hand, you still talk about, they still owe the land, economic power, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm still not able to quite figure out who are we today? Are we this people under some form of persecution beginning to dwindle with our culture under ginormous pressure from the central government, or are we a flourishing people? And if we are, whichever one of those two we are, what are our hopes for the future?
I think we are more of a kind of a dwindling situation, and people are getting poorer. More than that, we are flourishing. I mean, the leftists are saying that Afrikaners are flourishing, but that's a lie. I mean, we're not flourishing, not even remotely. And, Afrikaans culture has become the sort of more public culture has become very shallow, and I mean, people speak, terribly badly, and, there's a lot of confusion, and they're very Americanized as well. I wrote a bit of a satirical piece in the Netwerk 24 not so long ago about that, of how Americanized South Africa has become. But we are sort of waiting, and it comes back to my point about what Jan Smith said, that, our destiny will be determined from outside, because we've always been, to some extent, a colony. I think the National Party, when they walked out of the Commonwealth in 1960, or whenever it was, it became a republic in 1961, then we became really sovereign. For, I think the only other period was probably in the 1880s and 1890s in the Transvaal and the Free State. We were also, those were sovereign republics, although not really, because I think Britain still had some control over our exterior relations, even in the old ZAR in the 1890s. And we only got our own embassies in the 1930s. But after 61, we became a sovereign state. But it was also, in a way, kind of an overreach, I think, because we had all the means and the capacity and the economy to be a sovereign state, but I think we sort of faltered somewhere along the line. And I think to some extent we were still taking our cue from Britain. I had two discussions in my life with P.W. Botha when he was already quite elderly, but he was very lucid and coherent in what he was telling me. And he told me all sorts of anecdotes. He and his second wife invited me to stay there over a weekend, with 2 weekends there at their home there in Wilderness, near George. And it struck me that, he had a tremendous admiration for Margaret Thatcher. And he didn't understand that the British are always two-faced. They will never tell you what they really think, and they are very manipulative. And at the very same instant while Margaret Thatcher was kind of buttering him up, she was also, she and her ambassador here in South Africa were talking to the ANC. They were playing both sides. And eventually, and Britain played also a big role in, especially that British ambassador, Rennick. I mean, he's boasted about it afterwards in all sorts of interviews, especially more recently. He's dead now. He died a few years ago, or fairly recently he died. They also played a big role in getting the ANC into power. So I think the point is that we've always been a colony. So we are waiting for something to happen in the metropole, either in Britain or in Europe or in the United States, because there's now an American empire, and all of this stuff. And people are following this very closely. I mean, I'm totally astounded. It's probably like that in most parts of the world, but there's never been such an interest in American politics among Afrikaners as at present. It's almost as if they know more about American politics than they know about South African politics. So we are waiting for a deus ex machina. We're waiting for some sort of a solution from outside. I think that we're not able, and we're not intellectually ready. We don't have the ideology to do it ourselves here, but we are waiting for something from outside. And depending on how geopolitics now plays out, and the war in Ukraine, and the whole, the new Cold War between Russia and America, something might happen in South Africa. So we are sort of biding our time. And I think a lot of Afrikaners, even though they might not understand it in those terms, I think they do have that sense that the current regime is weakening. It's come under a lot of criticism, also from these liberal journalists in Johannesburg. It's amazing to see the same people who used to absolutely idolize the ANC are now writing vicious hit pieces against the government. So everybody can see that that is going on, and they are getting weaker. So something is bound to happen.
What are we talking about, Dan? I mean, what is that solution? You say we're waiting for a solution. The solution was meant to be 1994, the creation of the multiracial democracy. Now, clearly, that's not your view of the solution. The argument
because that was also kind of a colonial.
But my question then is, what is the solution? What is the solution? I think the one or two questions that I ask you is, what's the future of the Afrikaner? What role will the Afrikaner play in the future of South Africa? And what in particular is the future of how does the Afrikaner see himself? And I know we can't talk about the Afrikaner. It seems to me from outside that there are really two Afrikaners at the moment, the so-called progressive left and the so-called right wing. Now, I'm not quite sure what that mix looks like and what percentages goes to which of these two groups. I'm not quite sure about that. That remains vague for me. But what is that solution that we're talking about? Are we talking about, in practical terms, Freedom Front plus Article 235, own home for Afrikaans? What are we talking about?
Yes, well, I think in practice, I think Flip Base from Solidarity, he's also made comments to that extent that there's a certain movement or a kind of a regrouping of Afrikaners in certain municipalities. And, so there are kind of enclaves in South Africa and also in the countryside. There are quite a lot of towns that have been taken over by Afrikaners. And I think this whole thing around Starlink at the moment with Elon Musk, that's a very important issue, because I imagine that if Starlink would come to South Africa, that you would see a significant movement out of the cities, because to some extent the cities have become unbearable with crime and the kind of the decay and so on, and you would see a lot of people flocking to certain rural towns where they would set up, make a new life there with their Starlink on the roof. But when you talk about, look, I think this whole system in South Africa that came about in 1994, that's just my opinion, but it was already a redundant and failing system elsewhere in the world. And, maybe I should also always threaten to write books about things, but
Dan, if you say it as a failing system elsewhere in the world, what are you talking about? You're talking about multicultural democracies?
I mean, the whole idea of this kind of melting pot, of course, was famously formulated by a Swedish economist by the name of Gunnar Myrdal in the 1940s. And, the American government, or no, it was the Carnegie Foundation, I think they got him to America to solve their racial problems. And he famously, wrote, some books, and that became and those books, the ideas in Myrdal's books became actually, it was embodied in law in South Africa and in certain judgments of the Supreme Court of the United States. And then it started being applied. And affirmative action was one of those ideas. It started being applied in America from the 1950s and the 1960s onwards. And by the time it got here, it was already a dead idea. And we took this dead idea from America and we institutionalized it here. And then obviously it was going to fail. It was failing in America. It's failing all over the world. And now we're sitting
Dan, define that dead idea for me. I don't quite get that. Are you talking, is the dead idea the
dead
idea of
is the notion
multiculturalism?
yeah, exactly. Multiculturalism and the melting pot. It's not working. You know, in France, because I mentioned to you that I follow, because I lived in France for 7 years and I speak French, and, I can watch any program in France, any discussion on TV or whatever, and understand 100% what's going, there isn't a nuance or something that I miss. So I sometimes get very interested in the French debates and so on, and for a week or two, I would sort of live a French life almost in front of my computer. But if you, in France, they're talking about the failure of they call it the vivre ensemble, the living together. They say that the living together has absolutely failed. And now, just like the melting pot thing failed in the USA, and now people are searching for other ideas, and there are more or less radical ideas. I mean, there's this Rupert Lowe character in the UK who now wants to send everybody back who isn't British. And so that's quite a radical idea. And you've got something like Zemmour in France who's saying the same thing.
Can I jump in here?
So all of the other countries are now experimenting with more radical ideas, except in South Africa. We are sort of stuck in the past, and we've always been stuck in the past. One of my big frustrations at university, and especially this kind of, I don't know, colonial communist university here in Johannesburg, was that it's really so backward, and it's frustrating because they do not, it's almost as if we are out of touch with the zeitgeist in the Western world. We're always 20 or 30 years behind. Even now with the internet, we've got instantaneous communication, and we get the same news as the Americans and the British or the French or the Germans or whoever, the Dutch. We are still in our mindset, and I think institutionally we lag the rest of the world by about 20 or 30 years. So whatever plays out now in Europe or in the USA will probably only hit us in a decade or two. Is my sense of it. It's starting to infiltrate, but it's not quite there yet. And also among the Afrikaners, because it also comes down to conformism, and you've heard about the Overton window. And so on, and in South Africa, the Overton window has shifted to the left. So Julius Malema and the EFF, with this sort of quasi-Marxist ideology of theirs, that is now mainstream politics in South Africa. But anything, when you're talking about self-determination, federalism, concepts like that is sort of completely off the charts. There's no real public debate about that. So, but I would say the future of South Africa, it's going to be some form of federalism, I would say.
I just want to challenge one thing, Dan, if you allow me. Just one moment. I want to challenge this, because you seem to refer to what you would call, I would imagine, the failed multicultural, the experiment with multiculturalism in Europe. I think that's what you're referring to. I've got something to say about that. I think it's an overstated thing that you're saying, but be it as it may. In the South African context, though, and this is what I don't understand about the argument. It seems to me that you're suggesting that multiculturalism in South Africa is something that is kind of experimentally forced or imposed upon us. That's what I get from what you say. And in the processes here in Europe, you might interpret it in the same way. But isn't it more realistic to see multiculturalism as the product of an inescapable historic developments and migration patterns that come across, that came through for that matter, thousands of years. That is not a matter that we're not imposing a multiculturalism on South Africa. That multiculturalism is a natural given in South Africa, given the history and the composition of the peoples of South Africa. It's not an artificial. The imposition of the new South African Constitution is not some kind of an imposed experiment on South Africa. It's taking in cognition the realities of what we've got.
Why did they have to place bombs in the supermarkets to get it here? If it was such a natural thing. And I'm not the most well-read person in the world, but there's a right-wing, it's also supposedly a right-wing French philosopher called Alain de Benoit, who's got apparently the biggest private book collection in Europe. And he's got 100,000 books he's got 2 houses and he's got 100,000 books. So I'm not at his level, but, I've read quite a lot of South African history and, political debates going back quite far. And it seems to me that this whole solution that was what you would call multiculturalism, or the sort of one man, one vote, winner takes all, for about 100 years, it was debated in Afrikaans and in English in South Africa and even elsewhere in the world. And for most people, it was the most ghastly solution of all, and the one that they were prepared to fight to the death to avoid. And yet, it was finally, imposed from abroad. It was imposed by Sweden. Sweden financed this whole thing, and the Soviet Union. And today, Sweden, the Sweden Democrats in Sweden have about a third of the vote or something, and they are trying to kind of cast off. To them, it's a form of horror that they are experiencing in Sweden. So, but the Swedes in 1980 had absolutely no experience of multiculturalism, but they wanted to impose it on us because they thought it was the right thing to do here. And
but I want to once again just try to suggest.
Yeah, okay. So,
just try to say is I'm saying that nobody's imposing multiculturalism on South Africa. It's not an experiment. It is a natural order of things. As it's a multiculturalism in South Africa is the product of history. It's a product of migration patterns. It's the product of convergences from all sorts of parts of Africa, parts of Europe to this piece of land. It's taken us, at least what we can historically track back 450 years or 400 years since. It's a naturalism. It is what it is. So in other words, we have a natural state of
we didn't have multiculturalism in...
No, because we had apartheid before that. And the bombs that you talk about that were placed to actually unsettle that was a those were that you're talking about.
Yeah, but that didn't happen spontaneously either. And then that was financed from abroad, right? It was a specific attack on the South African state. And I mean, all over the Marquis de Sade, he had somewhere he said, he was a very decadent man, and he also, well, apparently he was one of the 7 prisoners in the Bastille on the eve of the French Revolution, and he was sort of haranguing the crowd outside the prison by means of a pipe that he used normally for his toilet or something like that. But he once said, your morality, speaking from his point of view, morality is just geography misapplied. So you
say that again, please, Dan. Morality
is just geography misapplied.
I get you.
Okay, so to the Marquis de Sade, like pedophilia, that was his thing. I mean, if you read his books, it's all amoral and whatever, pornographic and so on. But the point is that there are various, throughout history, there have been so many political systems. There's been monarchy or autocracy, oligarchy. You know, you use, I think Aristotle and Plato, I mean, they enumerated 4 forms of government that have held throughout history. So, and even in the world today, I mean, there's a huge variety of political systems all over the world, you know, in Switzerland or Germany, even the United States. If you had to, some Afrikaners in the early 90s wanted to have a Swiss cantonal system in South Africa, but that was seen as simply a continuation of apartheid, and that was never taken seriously. At the same time, you have a country like the United Arab Emirates, where, you know, I read this the other day. There are about 1.1 million citizens in the United Arab Emirates. And there are 12 million non-citizens with no rights. They do not vote. If they commit the slightest crime, they are simply deported. And nobody in the world is criticizing United Arab Emirates for that system in their country. And the way I see, you know, the South African system that evolved over centuries was, in a way, it was a sort of a patrician system, in that the Afrikaners played a key role in that they were eventually in government, in the military, and in the arts. But they were not the merchant class. There were a few of them in the merchant class, but they were not in the merchant class. And then you had a kind of a whole grouping of, you know, say immigrant, you know, plebeians and whatever, you know, people who didn't really have political power. But the Roman Republic, you know, existed like that for a couple of 100 years. And there was actually, I had a professor of Latin at university at the time. He was a bit of a reactionary later. I mean, when they closed down all the classics departments in South Africa, he went to England, and I think he became a barrister in London. But he drew parallels like that between South Africa and the old Roman system. And I think that kind of you need a population in a country that is patriotic and honest, and not in the first instance interested in looting the country to death. And the Afrikaner fitted that role perfectly, because they were Calvinists, they were very moralistic, and, you know, being too ostentatious or meretricious and so on, that was frowned upon. It's not like today. Today we are typically living in a country where the merchant class is really in control of a lot of things, and then they can manipulate the government, they can bribe people, and you can see it in the society, even in the lifestyle of people. We are, you know, we are being governed by people for whom money is the ultimate value. So, but I think a society like that cannot last forever. And eventually it does become too decadent. I think this whole Epstein thing in the USA is also a sign that the empire there has become too decadent. And South Africa is also will become too decadent, and it will eventually fall. So I think the Afrikaner, if it manages to hold onto some of its values, it will survive, and eventually it will rise like a phoenix from the ashes. There's also another.
Let me hone in on that. It will rise like a phoenix from the ashes. To do what, Dan? Phoenix. I beg your pardon.
Yeah, from the ashes.
To do what?
I think ultimately,
once again, just in practical terms. I'm just talking about pure. I understand the frustrations of
okay. First of all, I think Afrikaners will eventually. It might not be even de jure, but they would de facto be ruling themselves again, and the state will either become so weak that it won't be able to, push them around or force them to obey its laws, or they will, with a little bit of help from friends, what's that Beatles song, with a little bit of help from my friends, they will get some form of territorial, self-determination in South Africa. I mean, logically, it cannot happen otherwise, because either way it will just completely disappear, be assimilated. And, there was a man, he's also, I think, deceased now, but he used to write quite a lot on our website, a very brilliant academic from the Cape. And he read all sorts of books. All over the world, there are these, from the colonial era, there are these kind of Western minorities that in places like Sri Lanka and others that remained after independence, and those would eventually dwindle, their numbers would dwindle, and they would be eventually just assimilated. And they would be creolized into the rest of society. Now, that is one.
That is obviously the fear in South Africa, and I think you've defined
exactly. I think, and that is one possible outcome here.
I get that. I get that. My question, though, is just, apart from the fantasy and the idea or the romance of the idea, whatever the case might be, spell it out for me in real. Are you saying that the Afrikaner can only, by definition, survive if it has that own geographical territorial space in which it can live and live out its culture? That's what you're saying in the long run?
I think so, yes.
And if it doesn't have that, let me just go.
I think always,
and I want to pull that thought through. Fine. If it doesn't have that, it means then, in your view of things, the ultimate withering away and disappearance of the Afrikaner culture. That's your philosophy.
Yes,
am I putting that
definitely.
In?
Definitely.
Okay. I can now the question is, Dan, now the question would become then, okay, somebody said the other day to me, South Africa is like a scrambled egg. How do you unscramble the egg, and how do you find that territorial geographic space? Because the last time that I checked, there is in fact not even one single, I think I'm correct if I say not one single municipality in South Africa where there's a clear white majority, let alone an Afrikaner majority. How do you realize such a massive dream in realistic terms without making fanciful promises or kind of emotional symbolisms to people? How do you realize that?
Well, obviously there are the more kind of, what we don't call them, the more serious or cataclysmic events that have taken place in the 20th century. We had the division between Pakistan and India, where millions of people moved within a short space of time. I referred to the Algerian example, where 1 million people had to depart for France within a month or 6 weeks.
We can talk about the Balkanization of Yugoslavia if you want to have a modern reference.
Balkanization of Yugoslavia. And, there are all these examples. So, and I think if there's a sort of a social breakdown in South Africa, then people would have to move to some sort of part of the country where they would feel safe. And security and safety are major. I mean, it's the major issue in South Africa more than anything else. I can tell you that. I mean, even among these liberal English speakers who are proponents and kind of advocates for the multicultural society and the melting pot and so on, those same people are extremely sensitive to their own personal security. I can tell you that. And the slightest sort of threat on the horizon starts to worry them. So if the process of breakdown of the social order and crime and violence and so on, if that had to follow the same trajectory as it has over the past 30 years, and then it will become almost inevitable that people will look for some other solution. Up until now, they found it in a sort of a privatized. You talk about fantasy. we're already living the fantasy. This is a sort of a, I mean, the only things we haven't got intellectuals in South Africa because we've only, I mean, the only so-called intellectuals in South Africa are these kind of university, what would you call them, functionaries or something.
Yeah.
And they don't have the imagination nor the kind of exploratory mindset to actually describe things in South Africa as they are. But we're living in this fantasy world. We're living in theme parks. We're living in a Tuscan village. You can live in a Tuscan village with armed security guards, and you can imagine yourself in Italy and eat pizza and whatever. But in the meantime, you're in South Africa. Yeah, but that's your Italian Volksstaat right there, and it's functioning today, and it's legal, but it's all seen from a certain perspective that it's a sort of a privatized security village. And I've often thought that, if only these Afrikaner billionaires had any sense, they would just construct a kind of a security village for us somewhere with buildings, high-rise buildings, and a whole city. I mean, like they did in Dubai. We could build a whole city somewhere, say in Orania. But
let me ask you this, Dan. I mean, let me just ask you this, and I think it's a reasonable question to ask. We are now 30 years into democracy in South Africa. Orania was founded, I think, somewhere in the mid-80s, if I'm correct. They have, I think, a population of 3,000 people. If there is this urge, this desire, this need for, this drive towards the idea of an own little space, why, for example, hasn't Orania not just taken off and exploded into becoming a big city? Without all the, I know the practical problems with it all. I understand that it's difficult. But is there really, and that's what I'm really trying to figure out, is there really a realistic kind of a stomach for what you're proposing when you talk about an Afrikaner, let's call it a homeland for a lack of a better word?
Yeah. Okay. I think Willem Petzer made a point about that in your interview with him. And I tend to agree with him. And it's also a notion that, I've had for a while, and that is that there is a specific reason why the Northern Cape is very sparsely populated. It's never, apart from, of course, the discovery of diamonds in Kimberley and so on, it's never been, it's an arid area, it's a desert, semi-desert, and it cannot sustain a large population very easily. So,
let's accept that argument, Dan. Let's accept that argument and help me.
But now, when you're talking about, somebody, an anonymous person, sent me a very interesting, PhD, what do you call it, proefskrif, thesis, about Johannesburg, at the time of the discovery of gold and so on. And even before gold was discovered in Johannesburg, it was already quite densely populated. The whole farms around here, the farms on which the gold was discovered, were already inhabited by people. And there was a lot of economic activity and agricultural activity here. And this place was a kind of a paradise. And that's why so many people came here. And of course, after gold was discovered, hordes of people moved here. But I wrote, towards the late 1990s, I wrote a piece somewhere, and there were even sort of commentary in the newspaper. There was commentary in the newspapers about that, where I said that, we should develop Pretoria into a kind of an Afrikaner city-state for us. And that's perfectly feasible. I think we should and this whole thesis thing that I'm reading on Johannesburg is also, and the role that Afrikaners played in the building of Johannesburg. But I think, cities are extremely important. And for some historical reasons, Afrikaners, except for Pretoria, have never really built a proper city in South Africa, or, created a kind of a metropole. So I think that is, for me, a very fruitful idea to explore. And there's a very large, still to this day, even though a lot of people have also semigrated down to the Cape, but there's still a fairly large population, say at least 1 million people within a certain geographical area in and around Pretoria. And I think that could become a kind of a future Afrikaner political entity, except that you don't, the local politicians, and especially from the big fat English party, the DA, they don't think along those lines. They don't want, they believe in the multicultural society and the melting pot and so on. So they're never going to voice that. But as things deteriorate, especially at the urban level, the cities are becoming more or less unbearable because of the shortages of water, especially. So it's going to, at some other point, it could become an issue that people will want to have their own city. Afrikaners would like that. And there's already, there's a huge amount of things happening there. I just see in my thing, ordering things online and discovering things on the internet, there are more and more products coming from places in and around Pretoria. So there's a definite sort of economic settlement there as well. And that's got a lot of potential. But of course, I think the reason why the Boshoffs went the Ronja route was that Pretoria was also the center, of course, of government. So it was inevitable that it would also be taken over by, I call them people from the East Coast of South Africa, by the Xhosas and the Zulus there. And they would eventually establish themselves there in Pretoria, although in practice, a lot of ANC politicians live in Johannesburg. They don't like Pretoria. So I think there's a potential there to form some sort of a city-state in the future. And that would be the start of some form of self-determination. But then the other point I wanted to make was the one about tradition. I told you about my discussion with left-wing French philosopher who visited South Africa, Régis Debray. But together with him, there was an Italian. And he's also kind of a left-wing guy. I think his name was Giovanni Vattimo. And in his talk, he said something about tradition. And he said, he was a leftist, so he wasn't a nationalist. He said he wasn't. I don't really feel very Italian. Only when I eat do I feel Italian. But he also said something about tradition. It's like a kit bag that you've got on your back, and you can take things out of it as you need them along the road. And now, of all the peoples in South Africa, the ones with the strongest tradition are the Afrikaners. They are the only ones that have really developed a coherent tradition. And, I see it almost like software and hardware. The people are the hardware, but the software is the tradition. So even if the hardware dies, the tradition can still find other hardware and to continue. And the Afrikaner tradition is just so elaborate that it's going to survive. Definitely, it is going to survive. And as long as that tradition exists, it will have to find a political outlet. And it's like these little countries, from the ex-Soviet Union. I've also looked at the Baltic states and Estonia and Lithuania and what's the third one? Letland. That's yeah. What do you Latvia in English? Why do they call it Latvia in English? I wonder why. But anyway, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. Now, in Estonia, there are only 1.2 million people, and they were under the Russians. And they were being Russified, just like we are being anglicized today. And still, but they got their Deus Ex Machina in 1990, in 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell. I always say the Berlin Wall hasn't fallen in South Africa. It's still there. I mean, communism is still a popular idea in South Africa. It's still got a lot of prestige.
Yeah, yeah.
So, but sooner or later, the Berlin Wall will finally, the reverberations from the falling of the Berlin Wall will reach us here, and then things will change. There will be social change. South Africa has had more social change over the last 30 years than most European countries in centuries. Yeah. In fact, most Europeans would not even cope with this amount of social change.
Yeah, Dan, I think we've run way over time already on this, but just one observation and then one or two very short questions. The observation that I want to make, and I insist on making, is to say that no matter what you say, no matter what Willem Petzer says, no matter who says where, I have never seen in my lifetime the Afrikaans culture thrive as much as it does at this point in our history. I think it's worthwhile reflecting upon that. The question that I want to ask you is there in this ideal of something like a 235 implied motherland, homeland, Thuisland, Volksstaat, whatever you want to call it, anywhere in South Africa geographically, could that happen without having to literally ethnically cleanse other people? Is that possible?
Well, I think so, definitely. One of the people involved in drawing up maps and stuff in the early 90s, his name is Koos Reineke. And he now lives in Namibia, as far as I know. But he told me that when he was doing all his surveying of South Africa, I mean, he would fly in a light plane across South Africa, and sometimes he would be scared that if he had to land somewhere, he would be so far from the nearest town that he wouldn't have food and water, to get there. But so there are vast areas in South Africa that are completely empty. This chaotic urbanization that we've had over the last 30 years, it's created these sort of dysfunctional metropoles that are the main population centers. So you wouldn't have to ethnically cleanse people from where, huge areas in South Africa. You just have to go and settle there. There would be no resistance whatsoever. It has to be economically viable. And that's our main problem, because we've got quite an urbanized, we're an industrial country, urbanized and so on. So we need cities. And that is the main question. But I think the Southern Cape is a very interesting area as well, because it's a majority Afrikaans area. It's geographically more or less, it's Afrikaans, white and colored, and it's geographically isolated more or less from South Africa, the rest of South Africa. So the only problem is you don't have kind of an independence movement there as you have in Alberta in Canada, because people there have it so good. They don't have most of the problems that the rest of South Africa has. When I drove there for the first time with my youngest son, he said, this feels like Europe. It's so tidy, it's so clean. And so that area could easily become a sort of the start of an Afrikaner state, I would say, a sort of a white and brown Afrikaner state. And there's already a harbor there. There's an airport. And people are very critical. And PW Botha had that airport apparently built. And Georgian people used to say it's a white elephant and things like that. But in fact, that airport is getting more and more busy. And a lot of Afrikaners moved down to that area, not only Garden Route, but still a little bit further on. So yes, there's a lot of movement of people taking place among Afrikaners, and a lot of them go to places in the Cape that are typically Afrikaans, where people speak Afrikaans, where the Afrikaans culture is the dominant culture. And that shows you that they are voting with their feet, many of them, for this idea. Yeah. And so they are creating a reality on the ground.
Yeah, I have one last question, and that would be, I'm in contact with Corneille Mulder at the moment. We're trying to set up a date so we can have a chat as well around these themes. It seems to me, from when I listened to Willem Petzer, and he had a meeting with Corneille Mulder, that Article 235, there will be more attention given to it, I would imagine, by 2029. Would you, if you were to advise Corneille Mulder, would you say to him that that's the way to go, or would you say it's hopeless?
Well, I don't think they've got anything to lose, because until now, the Freedom Front has not really succeeded in getting much of the Afrikaner vote, or any other vote for that matter. So they might as well, try to live up to their raison d'être, which was of, in 1994, when the party was formed under Constant Viljoen, it was Afrikaner self-determination. Yeah. But somehow that fell by the wayside. So I think they might as well try it, because, to be a small party for the next 50 years, it's going to give a few people their parliamentary jobs and so on, but it doesn't help anyone else. And I think they have to try that. Or if they don't, another party might come along that might steal their thunder, as it were, because there is a definite disillusionment currently with the big fat English party, the DA. And so people are looking for alternatives, I think.
Yeah.
So there is some flux in the South African political situation at the moment. There has been for a time, because the ANC is in decline. I think they've shot their load, as it were, and they've been found, and they're just too incompetent and greedy and corrupt. So something has to happen in South Africa, and probably, depending on the geopolitics, if the whole MAGA movement stays strong in the US, and there's a good chance that Jordan Bardella will become the next president of France, and yes, and that will be also, and so the potential for outside kind of pressure on South Africa becomes greater by the minute, I would say.
Yeah. Dan, I think we're really out of time. I noted that we are both born in 1957, so we're the same age. As a closing statement and just a short comment from you, I think I would be realistic and fair to say that you and we will not be around if there is ever to be a Volksstaat. Is that a fair assumption to
well,
this discussion with?
My response to that would be, 1 month before the Berlin Wall fell, I visited West Berlin, and then the people in his house we were staying, they were very politically connected and whatever, at least the parents were, and they told us, that the GDR is the best run of all the communist states, and it's going to last for another 100 years. And 1 month later, it fell. So, I think history is inherently unpredictable.
Yeah.
Anything can happen, literally.
Yeah. I get your point.
So in South Africa too. anything can happen.
Yeah, let me say, I really get your point, because I was in Germany at the time reporting about the falling of the Berlin Wall, and I remember a week before the wall fell, I spoke to the German journalist, and I said, "What are the chances?" And he said 0, no chance whatsoever.
Yeah,
and literally a week later, the Berlin Wall came down. Dan Roodt, it's been great to talk to you. Thank you very much for this discussion.
Well, it was an enjoyable discussion. Thank you very much for inviting me, and good luck with your channel.